Look at him. He can't even remember his own name. What a gift from heaven. Those were the exact words the fiancé of a mafia boss whispered into her lover's ear, right beside the hospital bed of the very man she was supposed to marry, as he lay motionless with empty eyes staring into nothing. But there was one thing she didn't know. He hadn't lost his memory at all. He remembered everything. Every face, every number, every whisper spoken behind his back. For 12 days, the most feared mafia boss in Chicago had been performing the most flawless role of his life, and what he uncovered would shatter everything the traitors had so carefully built in the shadows. But wait. The story is darker than simple betrayal. She wasn't betraying him alone. She was sharing a bed with his own private attorney, the man who held every financial secret of his empire in his hands, and the two of them were working for an enemy who wanted him dead. If you think this is only a story about betrayal, you don't know anything yet, because the one person who saved this mafia boss's life was a bar waitress who didn't even have $200 in her account, a young woman desperately trying to find the money for heart surgery for her 7-year-old sister. And to save him, she will have to surrender the very thing that matters most in her life. If this story moved you, please hit like now to support the channel and share it with a friend who needs to hear this story. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on the bell so you won't miss the next stories to come. The clock on the wall of the rusty nail read 2:43 in the morning when Celeste Whitfield finished wiping down the last glass. The bar sat deep inside a dark alley on the south side of Chicago, the kind of place where the flickering neon outside wasn't there to welcome anyone in, but to warn them away. The smell of cheap beer, sweat, and old cigarette smoke clung together into a thick, stale air that Celeste had been breathing for the past 14 months. She set the glass upside down on the shelf and tried not to look at her hands. On the back of her right hand was a half-moon burn from frying oil, still red and throbbing from the afternoon shift making chicken wings. Those fingers had once held syringes, once checked pupil response, once charted neurological findings with millimeter precision. Now they smelled like bargain dish soap and spilled Budweiser. Dwayne, the owner, came out from the back room just as Celeste reached for the thin coat hanging behind the door. He was a 45-year-old man, with a sagging beer belly and eyes that always lingered on her longer than they should. "Your tips, sweetheart." Dwayne dropped a few crumpled bills onto the counter, but the moment Celeste touched them, he caught her hand. His rough fingers closed tightly around her wrist, his thumb moving slowly over the back of her hand, right across her scarred hand. Celeste gave a small pull, but he didn't let go. "You know you could make more, don't you?" He grinned, his breath thick with alcohol as it hit her face. "You just have to be a little more agreeable." Celeste pulled her hand free with one sharp movement that wasn't rude, but wasn't soft either. She couldn't afford rude. She needed this job. She needed every last coin from this filthy bar. "Thanks, Dwayne. I'm heading home." She slipped the money into her coat pocket without counting it, walked quickly out the back door, and didn't look back. The walk home took 20 minutes. Celeste moved fast, head down, one hand clutching her coat closed against her chest. Her service shoes were so worn that the inner lining showed through at the heels, and every step on the cold sidewalk felt like stepping straight onto bare concrete. Her hair still smelled like beer even though she'd kept it tied back all shift. The apartment was on the 5th floor of a building with no elevator on Halsted Street. The wooden stairs creaked under every step, and the hallway smelled of mildew mixed with cooking from 3 or 4 different families. Celeste unlocked the door with a key chipped at the end and stepped into the 18-square-meter studio she called home. Penny lay on the narrow bed against the wall, curled beneath a faded daisy blanket. Beside her pillow was the handheld heart monitor Celeste had borrowed from the St. Mary Free Clinic. It blinked softly in the dark, green light washing over the sleeping face of the 7-year-old girl. That face was thinner than it had been last month. Her lips were a little paler than they had been last month, but her eyelashes were still long and curled, still trembling faintly when she breathed, like the wings of a sleeping butterfly. Celeste sat down on the edge of the bed, carefully enough that the old springs didn't squeak. She took the tip money from her pocket and counted it under the streetlight slipping through the cracked window. 2 20s, 1 5, 2 $1 bills, $47 for 10 hours on her feet, 10 hours of enduring Dwayne, 10 hours of swallowing humiliation. She looked at the old Nike shoebox beneath the bed. Inside was a stack of medical bills, $280,000. That number wasn't money. It was a death sentence for Penny if Celeste couldn't find a way within 3 months. The doctor at St. Mary had made it painfully clear at the last appointment. Penny's heart valve was failing faster than expected. The surgery couldn't be delayed any longer, and the charity clinic didn't have the equipment to perform it. 2 years ago, Celeste could have handled everything. 2 years ago, she had been a neurology nurse at Northwestern Memorial, one of the finest hospitals in Chicago, earning enough to care for Penny and start paying down the medical debt. Then came one overnight shift, one mistake that hadn't been hers, and a department chief who needed someone to blame. Celeste lost her license, lost her profession, lost everything except the 7-year-old sister sleeping in this bed. She leaned down and pressed a soft kiss to Penny's forehead. The child's skin was a little warmer than usual. Celeste placed her hand over Penny's left chest and felt the weak, uneven beat beneath her palm. That heartbeat was a countdown clock, and every day it seemed to grow a little quieter. "I'll find a way," Celeste whispered, her lips brushing Penny's fine hair. "I promise you." She sat there in the darkness, her back against the cold wall, listening to the steady blinking of the heart monitor, listening to the November wind in Chicago whistling through the crack in the window, listening to her own heart beating in rhythm with her sister's. $47. 10 hours. 3 months. 280,000. The numbers turned and turned in her mind like a broken machine with no switch to shut it off. And the way would come. But it would come from a world Celeste had never imagined she would step into. 4 days before Celeste sat in the dark counting $47, an armored Cadillac Escalade was tearing down Interstate 90 at 140 kilometers an hour, heading west into Chicago. Behind the wheel was Sullivan Voss, the man the entire underworld called Sully, 50 years old, a former mercenary, with half of his left little finger missing from an explosion in Fallujah, and the only man on earth Damon Kessler trusted without reservation. In the back seat, Damon was reading a real estate contract on his tablet, the blue light from the screen casting itself across the sharply cut face of the 36-year-old man half of Chicago feared, and the other half pretended not to know existed. Sully was the one who saw them first. 2 black SUVs without plates, one sliding in from the left lane, the other coming from the highway entrance ahead, forcing the Escalade into the middle like the jaws of a steel trap. Sully cursed, slammed the accelerator, and jerked the wheel to the right. The first burst of gunfire shredded the rear glass even though it was bullet-resistant. 3 rounds punched through the second layer. One lodged in the headrest beside Damon, less than 2 inches from his temple. The second shattered the side window, and the spray of broken glass sliced across Damon's chest through his suit jacket. The third round, or perhaps a piece of metal torn loose from the body of the vehicle, struck his right temple hard enough to turn everything black. Sully drove like a demon. The Escalade tore across the median, smashed through 2 marker posts, and made it off at exit 37 with all 4 tires still intact thanks to the run-flat reinforcement. When Sully looked in the rearview mirror, Damon was lying motionless, blood streaming from his temple down into the collar of his white shirt, his chest dark red, and Sully thought that for the first time in 20 years of service, he was about to lose the only person he had ever thought of as a son. The organization's private hospital operated out of a building that looked more like a dental office in the suburbs of Evanston. Damon's personal physician, a neurosurgeon who had once lost his license over a gambling addiction and now worked exclusively for Kessler Holdings, spent 4 hours removing every fragment of metal from Damon's chest and stitching the wound at his temple. The official diagnosis he gave to those who needed to know was severe traumatic brain injury, memory loss that could last for a long time or forever, a patient unable to recognize loved ones and unable to make decisions on his own. The news spread within 6 hours. From the hospital, it reached Preston Hale, Damon's private attorney. From Preston, it went to Margot Sinclair, Damon's fiancée. From Margot, it moved through every upper-class social circle in Chicago she wanted to impress. And from Preston, through a secret call on a disposable phone, it reached Bryce Thornton, the rival Mafia boss who had wanted Damon dead for years. But Damon hadn't lost his memory. 36 hours after the surgery, when the room held no one but Sully standing watch, Damon opened his eyes. Completely alert, he remembered every second of the ambush, remembered the angle of fire, remembered the type of vehicles, and most important of all, he remembered that only 4 people knew his route that night. Sully, Preston, the secondary driver who had died in the guiding tire blast, and Damon himself. Sully hadn't betrayed him. The secondary driver was dead. That left one man. Damon didn't tell Sully, "I'm fine now," he said. "From this moment on, I don't remember anything. I don't remember my name. I don't remember anyone's face, and you won't tell a single soul that I'm lying. Sully looked at him for a long time, then gave one short nod. That was enough. Damon began to perform. He looked into the mirror and asked, "Who are you?" With the panic of a man truly lost inside his own mind. He let the doctor lead him around as if guiding a child. He sat on the bed staring at the ceiling with such hollow eyes that one of the nurses had to turn away because she couldn't bear the sight of it, and he waited. Preston Hale came to visit on the second day. The 40-year-old attorney stepped into the room carrying white flowers and wearing the perfect expression of grief. "Damon, my friend, I'm here." Preston took Damon's hand, his voice trembling. Damon looked at Preston with eyes that showed no recognition, then turned away and stared at the wall. Preston stayed for 15 minutes, speaking in empty words of comfort. Then, the moment he believed Damon understood nothing, Preston pulled out his phone right there in the hospital room, not even bothering to step into the hallway, dialed a number, and said, faster than expected, "He can't even remember his own name. Start phase 2. Damon heard every word. The emptiness in his eyes didn't change at all, but beneath the hospital blanket, his right fist tightened until the skin went white. Margot came that same afternoon. She entered the room the way someone entered a photo shoot, with carefully painted red eyes, a silk handkerchief in one hand, and sobs timed just loudly enough for the nurses in the hallway to hear and feel sorry for her. But when the door closed and the room held only the two of them, Margot stopped crying. She walked to the bed and waved her hand in front of Damon's face as if teasing an animal behind glass. "Do you remember me?" "No, you don't, do you?" A smile touched her lips for a single instant. "Good." Then Margot sat down in the chair in the corner, took out her phone, and began to text. Damon watched through a slit of nearly closed eyes. The light from the screen reflected across Margot's face, and he saw it clearly. A message sent to Preston, followed by 3 red heart emojis, and a line he could read because the distance was just close enough. "He doesn't know anything. I'm coming to your place tonight." The rage rose from the bottom of Damon's stomach like acid. Every cell in his body screamed at him to sit up, to wrap his hands around Preston's throat, around Margot's throat, and let them both know that the Mafia boss they believed had been reduced to a broken mind still remembered every face, every lie, every stolen kiss. His fist clenched so hard his nails cut into his palm, and blood seeped out into the white hospital sheet. But Damon didn't rise. Because Preston was only a pawn, Margot was only a pawn, Bryce Thornton was the king, and Damon didn't play chess to take pawns. He was patient. He lay back down. He closed his eyes, and he kept performing. But Damon needed one more piece on the board. Someone completely outside the game, someone Preston couldn't control, Margot couldn't buy, and Bryce didn't even know existed. And that person, at that very moment, was wiping down the last glass in a ruined little bar 10 kilometers away from the mansion. The handwritten note contained only 4 lines. Damon waited until Sully came into the room to change the bedsheets, pretended to be asleep, then slipped the paper from beneath his pillow into Sully's hand, with a movement so quick that even the security camera in the room didn't catch it. Sully read it in the bathroom, memorized it, tore it into tiny pieces, and flushed them away. 4 lines. Find someone outside the system. Neurology background. No one in the organization knows her face. Bring her to the estate as a memory rehabilitation specialist. Sully understood at once. If Damon was going to pretend he had lost his memory, he needed someone to carry out rehabilitation therapy, so Preston and Margot would believe his condition was real and being treated seriously. But that person had to exist completely outside the network. Not a doctor inside a hospital system Preston could investigate. Not someone from Chicago's upper-tier medical circles Margot might know from charity galas. It had to be a ghost. Someone invisible. Sully started where invisible people often appeared. Charity clinics. He spent 2 days driving through the South Side, the West Side, and the southern suburbs of Chicago, gathering lists of volunteer medical staff and patients. At St. Mary Clinic on Ashland Avenue, he found the file of a young patient named Penny Whitfield, 7 years old, congenital heart disease, legal guardian, older sister Celeste Whitfield, 27 years old, occupation listed in the file as restaurant server. But in the guardian's medical history, there was a small line Sully nearly missed. Former neurology nurse, Northwestern Memorial Hospital, license revoked. Sully checked further. Celeste Whitfield, Graduated from a neurology nursing program at the top of her class, worked in the neurology department at Northwestern Memorial for 2 years, lost her license after a medical error she had always insisted wasn't her fault. No criminal record. No prior offenses. No ties to organized crime. $280,000 in medical debt for her younger sister. Current income, tip money from a bar on the south side. Sully closed the file, slid it into his coat pocket, and drove to the Rusty Nail. He arrived at 2:15 in the morning, 20 minutes before closing time. The bar was nearly empty, with only one drunk collapsed over the counter, and the scratchy sound of country music drifting from a speaker with one dead side. Celeste was wiping down the bar, her back slightly bent with exhaustion, her hair tied in a loose ponytail, her scarred skin glinting beneath the neon light. Sully took a seat at the bar, ordered a whiskey he had no intention of drinking, and watched. She wiped the counter with the tired precision of someone moving on muscle memory, but she was careful. She poured liquor to the millimeter without looking at the measuring line. Her hands were fast, neat, disciplined. Those weren't the hands of a bar waitress. They were the hands of someone who had once worked in an operating room. "I have a proposition for you," Sully said when Celeste set the whiskey in front of him. Celeste looked at him. Her eyes moved over him in one swift sweep from top to bottom. Old leather jacket, but good quality. An expensive watch hidden under his sleeve, though the edge of it still showed. Scarred hands. The posture of a man used to carrying a weapon. She had seen enough kinds of men in this bar to know the one in front of her wasn't there for a drink. "I don't do extra work after hours," Celeste said, her voice calm but unmistakably firm. "Not that kind of work." Sully almost smiled. Smart girl. "I need a neurology nurse to care for a businessman with traumatic brain injury, memory loss after an accident, to carry out cognitive rehabilitation therapy at his home." Celeste stopped wiping. The phrase, cognitive rehabilitation therapy, struck the exact corner of her mind she had spent 2 years trying to bury. "I don't have a license anymore," she said, her voice turning hard. "I know," Sully pushed the whiskey aside. "I don't need a license. I need someone with real expertise, someone who doesn't appear in any system, and someone who can start immediately. Live in, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, cash, no contract." "How much?" Celeste asked, and she hated herself for asking it so quickly. Sully named a number. Celeste showed nothing on the outside, but inside, it felt as if someone had hit her in the chest. The number was 10 times what she made now. That number, multiplied across 3 months, would be enough to pay the full cost of Penny's heart surgery. Penny's face rose in her mind, the slightly pale lips, the soft green blinking of the heart monitor, the trembling lashes like butterfly wings. "Who is the patient?" Celeste asked. "I can't tell you until you agree. I'm not agreeing to care for someone whose identity I don't know. You'll know when you arrive. I can only tell you this. He's a businessman. He was in an accident. The brain injury is real. He needs someone with real neurological training. Nothing you do will be illegal." Celeste looked at Sully for a long time. She knew he was lying about at least one part of it. Ordinary people didn't pay 10 times the market rate in cash for a nurse whose license had been revoked. Ordinary people didn't ask for someone who didn't appear in any system. But ordinary people also didn't have a 7-year-old sister slowly dying because her heart valve was failing. "I have conditions," Celeste said. "I go home to see my sister once a week, and if her condition gets worse, I get to bring her in at any time, without asking permission." Sully nodded. "Done. When do I start?" "Tomorrow morning. I'll pick you up at 6. Celeste looked down at her hands that smelled like dish soap and spilled Budweiser, hands that had once held syringes and now held a rag. She nodded once. Only once. That was enough. Celeste didn't know she had just agreed to walk into the estate of the most dangerous Mafia boss in Chicago. And by the time she understood, it would be too late to turn back. Sully's black car came to a stop in front of the wrought iron gates at 6:15 in the morning. Celeste sat in the back seat with an old backpack resting on her lap. Inside, she had only 2 changes of clothes, a toothbrush, a medical notebook she had kept from her days at Northwestern Memorial, and a photograph of Penny taken at Lincoln Park the previous summer. She had stayed awake all night after Sully left the bar, sitting beside Penny's bed, watching every breath her sister took, explaining to the woman from the 3rd floor next door how to use the heart monitor and which emergency number to call at St. Mary Clinic. She kissed Penny's forehead 7 times before she left. She counted every kiss. The gates opened automatically, and Celeste saw the estate for the first time. She had imagined a large house, but not this. The mansion stood on a piece of land in the Gold Coast, the wealthiest neighborhood in Chicago, where the price of each square meter of land was worth more than her entire apartment. The 3-story limestone house, roofed in copper turned green with time, stretched behind a row of ancient oak trees that had likely stood there before Chicago itself had burned in the Great Fire. Sully led her through a 3-meter-tall oak door, the kind of door Celeste had only ever seen in films about European castles. Inside, the main hall had a ceiling carved in Renaissance patterns, an Italian marble floor in cream with gray veins running through it like rivers, and a crystal chandelier hanging at the center, where the morning light poured through tall windows and broke into thousands of tiny rainbow flecks across the walls. Celeste could feel her worn-out shoes against the marble floor. Every step she took made a small sound, as if the house itself recognized that she didn't belong here. The scent of oak wood, beeswax, polish, and fresh flowers arranged in a Waterford crystal vase on the console table blended together into a fragrance she had never known in her life. The smell of money, the kind of money that couldn't be counted one wrinkled bill at a time from the pocket of a coat after a night shift. Sully brought her upstairs by way of a mahogany staircase with a banister carved in painstaking detail. The second-floor hallway was covered in thick, charcoal gray carpet that swallowed every footstep whole. He stopped before the last door at the end of the hall, knocked twice, then opened it. The room was the size of Celeste's entire apartment. The curtains were drawn shut. The only light came from the monitor beside the bed and a dim strip of LED lighting running along the baseboards. On a king-size bed made with immaculate white sheets, Damon Kessler lay perfectly still. Celeste stepped inside, and her nursing instincts came alive at once. In less than 3 seconds, her eyes moved over the patient from head to foot. Male, approximately 35 to 40 years old, large build, 6'2" or more, muscular even in a hospital bed, bruising across the left cheekbone and right jaw fading into yellow, white bandaging wrapped around the right temple, eyes open but fixed on the ceiling in an unfocused stare, pupils slightly dilated, no response when she entered his line of sight. Traumatic brain injury, memory loss, just as Sully had described. "Hello." Celeste pulled a chair beside the bed, and her voice shifted on instinct into the warm, measured tone she had once used with neurology patients at Northwestern Memorial. "My name is Celeste. I'm going to help you remember." Damon didn't respond. His eyes remained fixed on the ceiling, empty and drifting. Celeste began with basic therapy. She took the medical notebook from her backpack, opened to the page she had marked ahead of time on cognitive rehabilitation after traumatic injury. She showed Damon photographs of the estate from different angles that Sully had prepared, and asked simple questions. "Do you recognize this place? What do you see in this picture? Do you remember your name?" Every question was met with total silence or a slow, meaningless blink. She checked his reflexes by tapping lightly at the knee, tested pupillary response with a small flashlight, and wrote everything down in the notebook. Then she placed her hand against Damon's forehead to check his temperature. Her hand was rough. The skin had hardened from washing glasses thousands of times, had been burned by frying oil, had cracked from cheap soap. But when those fingers touched Damon's forehead, they were so gentle they were almost weightless. She touched him the way one touches something fragile, carefully, attentively, with complete respect for a human being in pain. Damon felt every finger clearly, through eyes nearly closed. He took note of everything. Shoes worn thin enough to show the inner lining, a half-moon burn on the back of her right hand, fingernails cut short, bare of polish, a cheap coat, but clean. And the hands, those rough working hands, moved with the precision of someone rigorously trained. Those weren't the hands of a bar waitress. They were the hands of a nurse. For years, people had touched Damon Kessler for only 2 reasons: fear or greed. The hands of business partners trembled when they shook his, because they knew exactly who he was. Margot's hands, when they slid across his chest, always came with eyes flicking toward the 7-carat engagement ring. Preston's hand on his shoulder had always hidden a knife behind it, but these hands were different. These hands touched him because he was hurting. That was all. Not for power, not for money, not from fear. Celeste drew her hand away, wrote normal, 99 into her notebook, and continued her work as if placing her hand on the forehead of a Mafia boss was something she did every day. Sully showed Celeste to her room at the far end of the second-floor hallway. It was much smaller than Damon's, but still 3 times the size of the studio apartment on Halstead Street. Celeste didn't care about the double bed or the marble bathtub. The first thing she did was open her wallet, take out the photograph of Penny at Lincoln Park, and place it on the bedside table. In the picture, Penny was grinning wide, both arms lifted toward the sky, her flowered dress caught in the wind, Lake Michigan bright blue behind her. Celeste stared at the photograph for a long time. "So Mama can always see you," she whispered, resting her hand on the glass as if she were touching Penny's cheek. Then she turned and went back to Damon's room to begin her first shift. She didn't know she wasn't the only woman in the mansion, and the other one wasn't going to welcome her. The black Bentley Continental GT pulled up in front of the mansion gates at 2 o'clock the following afternoon, just as Celeste was upstairs on the second floor carrying out Damon's afternoon cognitive assessment. Celeste heard the sharp click of high heels striking the marble floor on the first level before she saw anyone at all. The sound was steady, deliberate, and confident in the way only someone accustomed to walking on floors like this could be. Margot Sinclair stepped into the main hall in a white fur coat draped over a black silk dress, her blonde hair arranged in perfect waves, the scent of Chanel No. 5 trailing through the room like a declaration of ownership. Behind her, Preston Hale followed close, dressed in a gray 3-piece suit, a black leather case tucked beneath his arm, his 40-year-old face arranged into concern so carefully it seemed measured down to each line in his forehead. Sully stood waiting at the foot of the staircase, his arms folded across his chest. "How is he?" Margot asked, her voice trembling just enough, her eyes red just enough, her hand gripping a silk handkerchief just enough. A flawless performance. Preston placed a hand on Margot's shoulder with the kind of comforting gesture the two of them had rehearsed to perfection. "Sully, has there been any progress? We've retained specialists, but we need to know before making any legal decisions." Sully looked at both of them with unreadable eyes. "There's a new caregiver, a memory rehabilitation specialist. She started yesterday." Preston frowned. "Who hired her? I didn't approve any new staff." "I did," Sully said, his voice flat. "Per Damon's previous instructions, any medical decisions in the event he became incapacitated were to be handled by me, not by his attorney." Preston opened his mouth to object, but Margot gave his arm a slight squeeze, the signal for silence the two of them had agreed on long ago. No point starting a war with Sully too soon. "Of course," Margot said, offering a gentle smile. "We trust you, Sully. Please let me go up and see Damon." But Margot didn't go upstairs to see Damon right away. She and Preston turned first into the study on the first floor and closed the door behind them. The room had soundproofed walls Damon had once used for sensitive business meetings. Preston opened his leather case, pulled out a tablet, and began to explain. "No signature needed," Preston said, his finger gliding across a financial chart of Kessler Holdings on the screen. "I have system access as his personal attorney. Every day, I move pieces of the assets, shares, real estate contracts, into Bryce's shell companies. Small transactions. They look legitimate. Spread across 7 layers of intermediaries. No one will notice unless they know exactly what to look for." Margot sat on the edge of the oak desk, one leg crossed over the other, taking a sip of mineral water. "How long?" 2 weeks if everything goes smoothly. Damon's security layers are more complex than I expected, but I'm peeling them back one at a time." "And by the time he remembers?" Margot asked, one corner of her mouth lifting. Preston looked at her and smiled slowly. "By the time he remembers, there won't be anything left to remember." Margot set the glass down, stepped toward Preston, and kissed him lightly on the mouth. "I like it when you talk like that." 10 minutes later, Margot went upstairs. She pushed open Damon's bedroom door without knocking and found Celeste seated beside the bed, a small flashlight in her hand as she checked his pupil response, speaking in a quiet, encouraging voice. "Good. Your eyes are responding better than yesterday. That's a positive sign." Margot stopped in the doorway. Her eyes moved over Celeste from head to toe with the speed and precision of an airport scanner. A simple ponytail, no makeup, a white blouse washed so many times the fabric had grown thin, old khaki pants, and worn shoes that held Margot's gaze the longest. Those shoes told her everything she needed to know. "Who are you?" Margot asked, her voice sweet, her eyes cold. Celeste rose, turned, and looked directly at her. She recognized her at once. This had to be the fiancé Sully had mentioned. "I'm Celeste Whitfield, the memory rehabilitation specialist. I started yesterday." Margot stepped into the room, the scent of Chanel No. 5 spreading with her like a territorial mark. She looked Celeste over once again, paused at her scarred hand, then offered a smile as thin as paper. A memory rehabilitation specialist? You look more like a diner waitress. The line had been designed to cut, to see whether Celeste would shrink, flush, or break into tears. But Celeste did none of those things. She had Dwayne grabbing at her hand every night, and she still came back. She had a department chief frame her for a mistake no one believed she hadn't made. A cruel remark from a woman wearing a 7-carat engagement ring wasn't enough to make her blink. "I'm here for the patient," Celeste said, her voice neither high nor low, neither warm nor cold, perfectly calm. Then she turned back to the chair and resumed her work, as if Margot were no more than a passing draft. Margot stood there for a few seconds longer, her eyes narrowing. She wasn't used to being ignored. She turned on her heel, stepped into the hallway where Preston was waiting, and whispered close to his ear, "Keep an eye on that girl. I don't like the way she looks at Damon." Preston nodded and took note. 20 minutes later, the Bentley left the estate. Celeste stood by the window in Damon's room and watched the black car glide past the oak trees and vanish beyond the gates. She didn't know what had been said in the study downstairs. She didn't know about the plan to hollow out Kessler Holdings from the inside. She only knew that the woman who had just left had looked at her with the same expression she had seen in cats a moment before they pounced. Celeste returned to the bedside. Damon was still lying there, eyes fixed on the ceiling. Outside, the Chicago sunset stained the window glass red. Celeste sat down, and for the first time, she didn't begin therapy. She simply spoke. "You don't understand anything I'm saying, do you?" she asked softly, with the faintest trace of a smile. "It's okay. I'll keep talking. The doctors say a familiar voice can help patients with memory loss." She paused and looked out the window. "My sister's name is Penny. She's 7. She loves drawing butterflies. Every time she finishes one, she signs her name in the corner with a huge letter P, because she says that's what famous artists do." Celeste gave a small laugh, but her voice began to tremble. "She has heart disease. Since birth. I've been raising her since she was 2, ever since our mother died. She calls me Mama because she doesn't remember our mother's face." She stopped and swallowed hard against the ache in her throat. "I'm here because of her. Everything I do is because of her." Damon lay motionless. His eyes remained fixed on the ceiling, still empty, still unresponsive. But behind those eyes, Damon Kessler heard every word. Every single one. He heard Celeste's voice shake when she spoke about Penny. He heard the quiet laugh when she described the oversized letter P in the corner of each butterfly drawing. He heard the sound of her swallowing when she fought back tears. And for the first time in 4 days of lying in that bed, listening to lie after lie, for the first time since the bullet on Interstate 90 had nearly taken his life, Damon felt heat gathering behind his eyes. It wasn't rage. It wasn't hatred. It was something he had forgotten long ago. Something a Mafia boss wasn't allowed to have. Something he had buried deep ever since he was 14 and watched his mother die. It felt like tears. But Damon Kessler didn't cry. He never had. He only lay there, closed his eyes, and listened as Celeste told him about the butterflies Penny liked to draw. But Celeste, with the trained nurse's eyes that noticed what other people missed, was about to discover something no one was supposed to know. On the morning of the 3rd day at the estate, Celeste woke at 5, as she always did. She went downstairs to the kitchen to make oatmeal for Damon, the thin kind that was easy to swallow, the kind she cooked every morning because patients with traumatic brain injuries often had trouble chewing. The kitchen in the mansion was as large as the entire first floor of her apartment on Halsted Street, with a black granite island, a set of Wusthof knives hanging from a magnetic strip, and a double-door Sub-Zero refrigerator filled with organic food. No one in this house ever seemed to cook. While she waited for the oatmeal to simmer, Celeste opened the medicine cabinet mounted beside the sink. It was an old habit from her days at Northwestern Memorial, checking a patient's medications every morning, comparing them to the diagnosis, making sure the dosage and the type of drug matched what they were supposed to be. The cabinet held 7 bottles, arranged neatly on 2 shelves. Celeste read each label one by one. The first 4 made perfect sense. Pain medication, anti-inflammatory drugs, medicine to reduce brain swelling, and a multivitamin. All of them fit the diagnosis of traumatic brain injury, but the last 3 made her hand stop. The 5th bottle was lorazepam, 4 milligrams. The 6th was haloperidol, 5 milligrams. The 7th was scopolamine, the dosage written by hand on a separate label, with no prescribing physician's name anywhere on it. Celeste set the bottle of scopolamine down on the granite counter and stared at it beneath the kitchen lights. 2 years away from the hospital hadn't been enough to erase what she had learned. Lorazepam was a powerful sedative. Haloperidol was an antipsychotic, usually given to patients with schizophrenia, not traumatic brain injury. And scopolamine, at the dosage written on that label, was a cognitive suppressant capable of causing real memory loss if used long enough. Those 3 drugs together weren't meant to heal anyone. They were designed to keep a person fogged, stripped of awareness, and completely dependent. Someone didn't just want Damon Kessler to lose his memory. Someone wanted to make sure he lost it for real, and lost it forever. Celeste put all 3 bottles back in exactly the same places, her hands steady even as her heart began to beat faster. She didn't know who had prescribed those drugs. She didn't know enough yet about the web of power inside this house to accuse anyone. And she wasn't foolish enough to think opening her mouth in a mansion full of cameras and guards would be safe for her, or for Penny. She memorized the names of the drugs, the dosages, and the precise positions of each bottle in the cabinet. Then she carried the bowl of oatmeal upstairs as if nothing had happened. That afternoon, her phone vibrated in the pocket of her shirt while she was doing reflex work with Damon. She looked at the screen and saw St. Mary Clinic. Her heart tightened before she even answered. "Hello, Celeste. This is Nurse Rodriguez from St. Mary. Penny's had a mild fever since this morning, 100. We gave her something to bring it down, and we're monitoring her. There's nothing alarming right now, but protocol says I have to notify the guardian." Celeste thanked her, hung up, and stood motionless in the middle of the room for 15 seconds. 37.8. For a healthy child, that was a harmless low fever. For Penny, with a heart that was weakening by the day, any fever could be the first sign of infection, and an infection on top of congenital heart disease could kill her within days. That night, after giving Damon his medication according to the schedule posted in the room, Celeste returned to her own room. She sat on the bed, looked at Penny's photograph on the bedside table, and clasped her hands together so tightly that her knuckles went white. She wanted to run back to St. Mary that very second. She wanted to hold Penny and never let go, but if she left now, she would lose the job, lose the money, and Penny would lose her only chance at surgery. She closed her eyes, drew in a deep breath, and reminded herself. 3 months, just 3 months. On the night of the 4th day, at 2:17 in the morning, Celeste stepped into Damon's room to check the IV bag on schedule. The room was almost completely dark, lit only by the pale blue glow of the heart monitor and a thin line of moonlight slipping through the gap in the curtains. She moved quietly across the carpet and came to the bedside, her eyes on the IV bag hanging from the steel pole. It was nearly empty and needed to be changed. She reached up to check the flow valve, and at that exact moment, she looked down. Damon was looking at her, not with the empty eyes she had grown used to over the past 3 days, not with the drifting, unfocused stare of a man whose memory had shattered and left him unable to grasp anything around him. The eyes fixed on her were fully awake, sharp, cold, focused. They were studying her with the intensity of a man used to making life and death decisions in a single second. Celeste froze. Her hand remained lifted over the IV valve. Her body didn't move. Her breath stopped halfway in her chest. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds, stretched long enough to feel like 3 full minutes. Then Damon closed his eyes. Quickly. Too quickly. It was the kind of movement made by someone who had been caught, not by someone drifting back into sleep. But it was already too late. Celeste had seen. She didn't scream. She didn't run. She didn't call for Sully. The instincts of a neurology nurse, sharpened through 2 years in emergency rooms, told her to observe before reacting. She stood still and pretended to go on checking the IV, but her eyes began to notice what she had missed before. Damon's muscles. After 4 days of true immobility, a neurological patient would already begin to show wasting, but Damon's upper arms were still firm beneath the sheet. His calves still held definition. He was exercising when no one was looking. The fingers of his right hand. Celeste had noticed it yesterday but hadn't thought much of it then. Every now and then his index finger tapped lightly against the sheet, in rhythm with the music playing from the small radio she kept beside the bed as part of auditory stimulation therapy. A patient with real amnesia didn't tap in rhythm like that. Their brain didn't process music on that level. And beneath the pillow, Protruding just slightly was a small, glossy black edge she would have missed if the moonlight hadn't struck it at exactly the right angle. The corner of a second phone. Celeste put everything together in her mind the way a puzzle comes together piece by piece. 3 sedatives that didn't match the diagnosis, meaning someone wanted him truly impaired. Eyes fully alert at 2 a.m, meaning he wasn't amnesiac at all. Muscles that hadn't wasted, meaning he was moving when he was alone. A hidden phone under his pillow, meaning he was communicating or monitoring someone. He was pretending, and he was watching the traitors inside his own house. Celeste changed the IV bag, made her notes in the notebook with a hand that remained perfectly calm, then left the room without saying a word. Back in her own room, she sat on the bed, looked at Penny's photograph, and made a decision. She wouldn't tell anyone, not because she was afraid, but because she had seen the way Margot looked at Damon, and she had heard the way Preston spoke when he thought no one was listening. If she revealed what she knew, she would be placing a weapon in the hands of exactly the wrong people. The next morning, Celeste went down to the kitchen at 5. She opened the medicine cabinet, took out the 3 sedative bottles, and replaced each tablet inside with vitamin B12 tablets she had bought the week before at a pharmacy near St. Mary for Penny. The vitamins were the same size and almost the same color. She placed all 3 bottles back exactly where they had been, closed the cabinet, and started making oatmeal. And that night, when Damon let the familiar pills rest inside his mouth and prepared to spit them into a folded handkerchief the way he always did, he realized something was different. The taste wasn't bitter. There was none of the faint numbness on the tongue that lorazepam always left behind. This tablet was bland, almost a little sweet, like a vitamin. Someone had switched the medication. The only person besides Preston who touched the medicine cabinet was Celeste, the bar waitress with the worn shoes and the burn on the back of her hand. The girl he had hired to be a chess piece. The girl who was protecting him without being asked, without knowing who he truly was, and without demanding a single thing in return. Damon lay there in the dark, the vitamin still resting in his mouth, and for the first time since he began this game, he didn't know what the next move was. Because Celeste Whitfield wasn't a chess piece. She was the only unknown on the board he didn't control. And that, to Damon Kessler, was both frightening and so strangely unfamiliar that he couldn't find a name for it. From the night of the 4th day on, Damon began watching Celeste in an entirely different way. Before that, she had only been a tool in the plan, a chess piece Sully had placed in exactly the right position to make the performance of memory loss believable. But the vitamin tablet in his mouth changed everything. No one had asked her to switch the medication. No one had paid her to do it. She didn't know who he was, didn't know whether he was conscious or lost inside himself, didn't know whether what she did would ever be rewarded or would simply get her thrown out onto the street. She only saw the wrong drugs, and she corrected it. Instinct, conscience, or something Damon hadn't encountered in anyone around him for the last 20 years. He began noticing the small things he had ignored before. The way Celeste always washed her hands 3 times before touching him, a habit from the operating room she still kept even after 2 years away from practice. The way she checked the heart monitor every hour, even at 3 or 4 in the morning, though no one had asked her to take the night shift. The way she spoke to him in a low, steady, gentle voice, even when she thought he couldn't hear, because neurology textbooks said a familiar voice could stimulate the cognitive centers of a patient in a coma. She did all of it for reasons that went beyond money. Money was only why she came. But the way she stayed, the way she cared for him, the way she placed her rough hand on his forehead every morning to check his temperature with the caution of someone touching glass, those things couldn't be bought. Damon Kessler, a man accustomed to controlling every piece on the board, found himself for the first time facing an unknown he couldn't read, couldn't buy, and couldn't predict. It unsettled him, and at the same time it made it impossible for him to look away from her. On the night of the 5th day, Celeste finished her shift at 11, but instead of going back to her room, she pulled the gray velvet armchair closer to Damon's bed and sat down. She was tired enough that she could no longer keep up the professional wall she had built around herself over the past several days. Her back rested against the chair, her head tipped slightly to one side, her eyes on the ceiling in almost the same pose Damon had worn for days, and she began to speak. Not therapy, not cognitive exercises, just talking. "My mother died when I was 22, Celeste said, her voice so soft it sounded as though she were telling the story more to herself than to the patient in the bed. Pancreatic cancer. They found it too late because we didn't have insurance. She didn't go to the doctor until the pain got so bad she couldn't stand up anymore. Celeste stopped and drew in a slow breath. On the last night, she held my hand. Her hand was so cold. She said, "Promise me you'll take care of your sister." Penny was only 2 then, asleep in a crib in the corner of the hospital room. I was only 22, 22 years old, and already being asked to promise something that would last a lifetime. She gave a small laugh, but there was water in it. I didn't even understand what I was promising then. I only knew my mother was afraid, and I wanted her not to be afraid anymore. So I said, "I promise." Then she closed her eyes, and I kept that promise for 5 years. Damon lay motionless, his eyes closed, but his throat tightened so hard he had to swallow twice in a row. He was 14 when his mother died, not of cancer, not of illness. His father killed her with his own hands in the kitchen of their West Side house on a winter night when the heat had already gone out. Damon heard his mother through the thin wall, heard the sounds of impact, heard her cry for help, and then heard the silence that was more terrifying than any noise. He had made a promise that night too, but his wasn't a promise to take care of anyone. His promise was revenge, and he had kept it in his own way, by turning himself into the most terrifying thing the streets of Chicago had ever seen. Celeste's promise was to protect, Damon's promise was to destroy. The same kind of night, the same loss of a mother, 2 promises standing in complete opposition. And now the 2 of them lay inside the same dark room, only a few feet apart, each carrying a burden no one else could see. On the night of the 6th day, at 10:30, Celeste sat beside Damon's bed finishing her notes for the day. The room was quiet, except for the steady sound of the heart monitor and the rain beginning to tap softly against the window. She took her phone from her pocket, looked at the screen, and made a call. "St. Mary Clinic, Nurse Rodriguez speaking." "Nurse Rodriguez, it's Celeste. I wanted to ask about Penny." "Penny's doing better, honey. Her fever broke this afternoon. She's awake right now and wants to talk to you." There was a rustle on the line, and then Penny's voice came through the phone, small and weak, but still carrying the childlike softness Celeste knew more intimately than any piece of music on earth. "Mama?" "I'm here, sweetheart." "Mama's here. When are you coming home, Mama? I miss you. I drew a butterfly for you, but you weren't here to see it." Celeste covered her mouth with the back of her hand, her scarred hand, and bit into her own skin to keep from making a sound. Tears slid through her fingers and fell onto the open medical notebook in her lap, blurring the line that read, "Patient heart rate, 68, stable." "Soon, sweetheart," Celeste said, her voice so steady she wondered whether she had become this good at pretending without ever noticing. "Mama will come home soon. You be good, listen to Nurse Rodriguez, and Mama will bring you a real butterfly." "A real butterfly, Mama? I want a blue one." "Yes, a blue butterfly." "Mama promises." Celeste ended the call, laid the phone face down across her lap, and lowered her head. Her shoulders shook, her back shook, her whole body trembled in absolute silence. The kind of crying that makes no sound at all. The kind cried by someone who learned to grieve alone at the age of 22. She didn't know Damon was awake. In the darkness, his eyes watched the trembling line of her back, watched her narrow shoulders rising and falling with each silent sob, watched her hand pressed over her mouth to keep the sound from escaping because she didn't want to wake the patient. And for the first time in 20 years, since that winter night when he heard his mother screaming through the wall, Damon Kessler felt the urge to protect someone, not because that person had strategic value, not because it served a business interest, not because the wounded pride of a mafia boss demanded it, but simply because she deserved it. Because a woman who had sacrificed everything to keep a promise to her mother, a woman who replaced poison with vitamins for a stranger not because she was paid to, but because her conscience wouldn't let her do otherwise, that kind of person deserved protection. Damon closed his eyes again, but beneath the blanket, his fist tightened. Not with anger, with resolve. He was making himself a new promise. Only the second promise of his life, and the first one that had nothing to do with revenge. But Damon wasn't the only one watching Celeste. Margot was watching too, and what she saw was about to trigger something more brutal than any bullet. The Golden Dragon seafood restaurant sat deep inside an alley in Chinatown, the kind of place ordinary diners would never find because there was no sign outside, and the entrance looked like the back door of a laundromat. Preston Hale arrived at 12 noon on the 7th day, wearing a long coat that hid his suit, a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes, and made his way through the smoke-filled kitchen to the private room on the second floor. Bryce Thornton was already there. The rival boss, 45 years old, was dressed with almost shocking simplicity. A gray polo shirt tucked into khaki pants, looking more like a suburban father than the man who controlled the underground routes on the south side of Chicago. But his eyes didn't belong to any father. They were small, cold, and unblinking when Preston sat down across from him. "Slow," Bryce said. No greeting, no testing, no ceremony, just one word, dropped onto the table like a bullet. Preston swallowed. "Damon's security system has more layers than I expected. Two-way encryption, biometric authentication on some of the main accounts. I'm breaking through it, but I need more time." "Time!" Bryce repeated the word as if it smelled rotten. He set down the chopsticks beside the plate of dim sum he hadn't touched, leaned forward, and lowered his voice until Preston had to tilt his head just to hear him clearly. 2 weeks. If I don't have Kessler Holdings in my hands after 2 weeks, you'll disappear. Not the kind of disappear where you run off to Mexico. The kind where your wife has to bury an empty coffin. Preston left the Golden Dragon with his hands trembling lightly on the steering wheel of his BMW. 2 weeks. 14 days to break through the security system Damon had built over 10 years, move the assets through 7 layers of shell companies, and vanish before anyone noticed. He drove straight to the estate, waited until Sully went out to buy supplies, then slipped into Damon's study on the 3rd floor. The room was locked with a 6-digit code, but Preston knew it because Damon had given it to him 2 years earlier to handle legal documents. He opened the door, turned on the desktop computer, and started searching. Passwords to the primary accounts, access codes to the international wire system, anything Damon might have written down somewhere in this room. Preston opened every drawer, flipped through every notebook, checked the back of every painting on the wall. He found nothing. Damon Kessler wasn't the kind of man who wrote passwords on paper. While Preston was tearing through the study upstairs, Margot arrived at the estate without warning. She drove the Bentley alone, without Preston beside her as usual, stepped through the front door with the private key Damon had given her when they got engaged, and went straight upstairs to the 2nd floor. She pushed open the door to Damon's room and stopped short. Celeste was sitting in the gray velvet chair beside the bed, her right hand holding Damon's left, her mouth moving softly as she said something too quiet for Margot to hear from the doorway. It was a tactile stimulation exercise that Celeste performed every afternoon, holding the patient's hand, gently pressing each finger, asking, "Can you feel this?" to test peripheral neurological response. Completely clinical, completely medical. But Margot didn't see clinical care. Margot saw another woman holding her fiancé's hand, and at that exact moment, Damon gave Celeste's hand the slightest squeeze. Just a tiny reflex, his fingers curling for a second around hers, then letting go. To a doctor, it was nothing more than a grasp reflex from a patient with neurological injury, unconscious and meaningless. To Celeste, it was a positive response to record in her notebook. But to Margot, standing in the doorway with eyes that had learned jealousy before they had ever learned love, that brief squeeze was a sentence. She saw Damon's fingers close around Celeste's hand. She saw Celeste's faint smile when she felt the reaction. She saw the distance between Celeste's face and Damon's face, closer than any distance Margot herself had shared with him since he had been lying in that bed. Margot didn't slap her. She didn't scream. She didn't storm into the room, make a scene, smash a vase, or throw anything. Margot Sinclair wasn't Victoria Sterling in a fairy tale. She was a former model who had survived 10 years in the fashion industry by knowing exactly when to smile, when to cry, and when to stay silent and strike from behind. She stepped back, so lightly the carpet made no sound at all. She turned away, walked down the hallway, descended the stairs, and went out into the back garden where there were no security cameras. She took out her phone and made a single call. It lasted less than 2 minutes. Margot didn't say much. She gave only a name, an address, and a request. The name was Penny Whitfield. The address was St. Mary Free Clinic on Ashland Avenue, Southside Chicago. The request was simple. Withdraw all medical support. Margot ended the call, deleted the call history, walked back into the house, and went upstairs to Damon's room wearing a sweet smile as if she had just stepped outside for a breath of fresh air. "I came to see you," she said to Damon, bending to kiss him lightly on the forehead, exactly where Celeste laid her hand every morning to check his temperature. Then she turned to Celeste and gave her a smile that, If Celeste had understood snakes well enough, she would have recognized as the smile that comes just before the strike. "Thank you for taking care of my fiancé. You're doing such a good job." Margot left the estate at 4 in the afternoon. At exactly 4:30, the phone rang at the reception desk of St. Mary Clinic. A cold female voice from the Chicago Community Medical Charity Fund delivered the message. All medical support for patient Penny Whitfield had been withdrawn, effective immediately. Reason: budget restructuring. The patient would be discharged from the clinic within 48 hours if the guardian couldn't pay for continued care herself. Nurse Rodriguez sat staring at the notice that had just come through the fax machine, then looked toward the room where Penny sat drawing butterflies on a sheet of printer paper with a box of crayons that had only 5 left. Then she picked up the phone and called Celeste. And when Celeste's phone rang in the kitchen of the estate, when the call from St. Mary came through in the trembling voice of the nurse, the whole world Celeste had spent so long struggling to build was about to collapse in less than 30 seconds. Celeste was washing the oatmeal pot in the kitchen when her phone vibrated against the granite countertop. She glanced at the screen, saw St. Mary, and answered with one hand still wet from dishwater. "Celeste, this is Rodriguez." The nurse's voice wasn't calm the way it usually was. Something in it had cracked, as though she were reading out a piece of news she herself didn't want to believe. "You need to stay calm and listen, all right? The Community Medical Charity Fund just withdrew all support for Penny, effective immediately. The clinic received the notice 30 minutes ago." For the first 2 seconds, Celeste didn't react. Her brain processed each word separately, as though they had been spoken in another language. "Withdrew all support, effective immediately." Then the words joined into a sentence, and the sentence became a reality, and that reality dropped into her stomach like a ball of red-hot iron. "Under policy, if the legal guardian can't cover the medical costs within 48 hours, Penny will have to be discharged," Rodriguez continued, her voice catching. "I know this is insane. I'm trying to reach the fund to ask why, but they keep saying budget restructuring. Celeste, do you hear me?" "I hear you," Celeste said. Her voice was so flat that even she startled at the sound of it. She ended the call, set the phone down on the granite, and stood motionless in the middle of the vast kitchen. Her hands were still wet. Water dripped from her fingertips onto the marble floor, each drop making a tiny ticking sound in the silence of the empty room. 48 hours. 2 days. Penny would be pushed out of the only clinic willing to treat her without demanding a deposit. Penny, with a heart that was failing a little more each day, would be lying on the narrow bed in the leaking 5th-floor apartment beside the borrowed heart monitor, with no doctor, no medication, no safety, nothing except a 27-year-old sister washing dishes in a stranger's mansion. Celeste clenched her fist. Her nails bit into her palm deeply enough to leave 4 small crescent marks in the skin. She didn't cry. She had cried enough already. She had cried on the bed in the apartment on Halstead. She had cried in the bathroom at the Rusty Nail. She had cried in the armchair beside Damon's bed the night before when she called Penny. Tears didn't pay medical bills. Tears didn't save a failing valve. She didn't cry, but she trembled. Her whole body shook lightly, not from fear, but from the fury rising out of the pit of her stomach. Because Celeste knew. She knew this wasn't budget restructuring. St. Mary Free Clinic had operated under the same funding source for 7 years. There was no reason to cut off support for a 7-year-old child with congenital heart disease on a Saturday, effective immediately, exactly 30 minutes after Margot Sinclair left the estate. Celeste remembered the night before. She had called Penny from Damon's room at 10:30. She had mentioned St. Mary. She had said Penny's name aloud. And she had never checked whether the bedroom door was fully closed or slightly open. Margot had been standing there. Margot had heard. And Margot had used that information like a knife, driving it straight into the weakest place in Celeste without ever having to touch her. The sound of high heels rang across the marble from the direction of the main hall. Celeste lifted her head. Margot stepped into the kitchen in a white silk dress, her hair falling perfectly around her shoulders, a glass of lemonade in her hand as if she had just come back from a stroll in the garden. The smile on her lips was sweet enough to rot teeth. "Oh, Celeste." Margot stopped, tilted her head, and looked at Celeste's face with a concern so carefully constructed it felt manufactured down to the last detail. "You look terrible. Is something wrong?" Celeste looked straight into Margot's eyes. She didn't lower her gaze. She didn't turn away. She didn't blink. "You know exactly what's wrong." Margot's smile didn't disappear. It simply changed shape, from sweetness into amusement, the kind of amusement a person wears when she has just confirmed that the blade went exactly where she intended. Margot set the lemonade on the island and stepped closer to Celeste until less than half a meter separated them. She tilted her head and brought her lips near Celeste's ear, whispering in a voice meant for only the two of them. Charity clinics really aren't very dependable, are they? I do hope your little sister will be all right. Celeste stood perfectly still. Every cell in her body screamed at her to seize Margot by that flawless blonde hair and force her face down into the sink. But Celeste wasn't the kind of woman who used her fists. She was the kind who stood in an emergency room at 3 a.m. with a patient dying in her hands and still kept her voice calm. She was the kind who was framed by a department chief before a disciplinary board and still didn't scream. She didn't step back. She didn't shake. She looked at Margot with an expression Margot had never seen in the bar waitress. It wasn't fear. It wasn't rage. It was the look of someone who had nothing left to lose. That look made Margot frown ever so slightly, as though the script she had written in her own mind didn't contain this scene. The prey was supposed to cry. She was supposed to beg. She was supposed to fall to her knees. Instead, the prey was looking at her with a calm so complete it was almost frightening. Margot turned on her heel. The sound of her heels moved steadily across the kitchen floor, then faded into the main hall. The front door of the mansion closed. The Bentley's engine receded into the distance. Celeste remained standing there, fists clenched, nails still pressed into her palms. Upstairs on the second floor, in the darkened bedroom, Damon Kessler was sitting up in bed with a small earpiece in his right ear, connected to the listening device he had placed in the kitchen on the second day. He heard every word. He heard the tremor in Rodriguez's voice over the phone. He heard Celeste say, "I hear you," in that flat, terrifyingly quiet voice. He heard Margot whisper, "I do hope your little sister will be all right," with all the sweetness of venom. Damon's fist tightened until blue veins stood out hard against his wrist. His jaw locked. The muscle at his temple jumped beneath the bandage. Everything in him demanded that he rise that instant, storm down the stairs, seize Margot by the throat before the Bentley reached the gates, and let her know that the Mafia boss she meant to betray was not only alive, but very, very angry. He turned, one foot almost touching the floor, but Sully's hand came down on his shoulder from behind. The old mercenary had been standing there, who knew how long, silent as darkness itself, and he spoke only 4 words, in a voice so low only Damon could hear. "Not yet, boss." Damon closed his eyes, drew in a breath through his nose, let it out through his mouth. Once, twice, 3 times. Then he opened his eyes, looked at Sully, and nodded. He lay back down, closed his eyes again, kept performing. But in the darkness, for the first time since this game began, Damon Kessler asked himself a question a Mafia boss was never supposed to ask. Was the price worth it? Was it worth it if a 7-year-old girl who loved drawing butterflies and called her sister Mama had to pay the price for his war? Damon couldn't find the answer, and the answer would come within the next 24 hours, when Celeste made a choice that even Damon himself had never seen coming. On the night of the 8th day, at 9:15, Celeste was changing Damon's bedsheets when she heard engines outside the gates. Not Margot's Bentley, more vehicles than that. She looked through the bedroom window and saw 2 black SUVs pulling up in front of the main entrance, followed by Preston's BMW. 4 people in white medical coats stepped out of the first SUV, each carrying an aluminum-cased box of medical equipment. Preston climbed out of the BMW with his leather briefcase under one arm, a phone pressed to his ear, speaking quickly to someone before ending the call and walking into the mansion. 10 minutes later, Sully knocked on the bedroom door. The old mercenary's face was as expressionless as ever, but Celeste caught something in his eyes she hadn't seen once in the past 8 days: helplessness. "Preston wants to see you downstairs," Sully said, his voice flat, though his jaw was set hard. Celeste went down to the first floor. Preston stood in the center of the main hall beside the 4 people in white coats, who were loading their equipment onto a stainless steel cart. He offered her the same polished smile she had already learned to recognize as the smile that came before the knife. "Celeste, thank you for everything you've done for Damon," Preston said, his voice smooth as silk. "However, after consulting specialists, we've determined that Damon's condition requires a more advanced neurological team. This is Dr. Reynolds and the Neurorehabilitation Unit from Johns Hopkins. They will be taking over tonight." Celeste looked at the 4 people in white coats. Dr. Reynolds stood at the front, a man around 50, silver-haired, with a professional smile. But Celeste's eyes, the eyes of a nurse trained to see what others missed, caught the details that were wrong. Dr. Reynolds' hands had none of the calloused wear typical of a neurosurgeon. The way he held the stethoscope was incorrect, and the Johns Hopkins logo on the coat had been stitched in ordinary thread rather than the industrial embroidery a top hospital always used. These weren't doctors from Johns Hopkins. They belonged to someone whose name Celeste didn't yet know, but she knew one thing with absolute certainty. If they entered Damon's room, the vitamin B12 tablets she had put in place of the sedatives would turn back into real drugs, and the man pretending to have amnesia upstairs would lose his memory for real. On what legal basis? Celeste asked, her voice calm, her eyes fixed on Preston. Preston frowned as if he hadn't expected the bar waitress to know how to ask that question. He pulled a document from his briefcase and handed it to her. Medical power of attorney. Margot Sinclair, as his lawful fiancée, has the authority to make medical decisions for Damon while he is mentally incapacitated. Under Illinois law, it's completely valid. Celeste read the paper. Margot's signature sat in the lower right corner, elegant and slanted across the expensive stationery of Preston Hale's law office. Everything looked legal, everything looked clean, and all of it was a trap. "You can gather your personal belongings tonight," Preston said, his voice still smooth. "We'll compensate you in full for the days you've worked. Sully will drive you home." Celeste folded the paper, handed it back to Preston, and turned away, walking up the stairs without another word. She had just reached the middle of the second-floor hallway when her phone vibrated. "St. Mary," she answered. And this time Rodriguez's voice wasn't only shaking, it was breaking. "Celeste, Penny's fever is 103.1. Her heart rate is irregular, 140 beats a minute, unstable. The clinic doesn't have enough continuous monitoring equipment anymore because the funding was just cut. You need to come now. I don't want to frighten you, but if her heart keeps behaving like this through the night, without proper monitoring, I can't be responsible for what happens." Celeste stood in the middle of the upstairs hallway. Beneath her feet was the dark charcoal carpet, above her, dim golden light. And on either side of her were two doors. To the left was Damon's room, the man pretending to have lost his memory in order to catch the traitors around him. The man whose poison she had replaced with vitamins. The man whose temperature she checked every morning with the touch of her hand and whose reflexes she tested every afternoon. The man she had told stories about Penny to every night, believing he couldn't hear a word. If she stayed, she could stop the fake Johns Hopkins team. She could protect Damon from the sedatives. She could keep him safe. To the right was the staircase, the main hall, the 3-meter oak doors, and beyond them, the world where Penny was waiting for her. If she left, she would lose the job, lose the money, lose everything she had fought to build over the past 8 days. Preston would send his people in. The sedatives would return to the cabinet. And Damon, whether his condition was real or not, would be in danger with no one there to stop it. Celeste stood there for 15 seconds. 15 seconds in which each second stretched into a year. Then she turned to the left, walked toward Damon's room, opened the door, and stepped inside. Not to stay, but to do one last thing. And before she walked out through the doors of that mansion, she was about to do the one thing Damon would remember for the rest of his life. Celeste pushed open the bedroom door and stepped inside for the last time. The room was dark, the curtains drawn shut, with only the pale blue glow of the heart monitor and the faint line of light from the hallway slipping through the crack behind her. Damon lay on the bed with his eyes closed, his chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm, the bruises on his face almost fully faded into pale yellow after 8 days. He looked like a man sleeping very deeply. He looked like a man who knew nothing about the world collapsing around him. Celeste knew that wasn't true. She had seen those clear, awake eyes at 2 a.m. 4 days earlier. She knew he could hear, could feel, and was playing a game whose rules she didn't fully understand. But none of that mattered anymore. Penny had a fever of 103.1, with a heart rate of 140, in a clinic that had lost its funding. There was nothing in this world more important than that. Celeste walked to the bedside. She didn't sit in the gray velvet chair the way she always did. She sank to her knees. Both knees touched the thick carpet, her body level with the side of the bed, her face even with Damon's hand resting on the white sheet. She reached out with both hands and took his left hand in hers. Her hands were shaking so badly that she had to hold on tighter just to keep his hand steady between her fingers. Her rough hands closed around the large, warm, motionless hand of the Mafia boss, and she felt the pulse beneath her fingertips. Steady, strong, alive, nothing at all like the pulse of a man who had lost awareness. "I have to go." Celeste's voice came out as a whisper, softer than the heart monitor, softer than the rain beginning to tap against the bedroom window. "My sister needs me. Penny has a high fever, and the clinic doesn't have enough equipment anymore. I'm sorry." She stopped, swallowed tears, swallowed the sob rising from her chest. "I know you can't hear me. I know to you I'm just a voice in the room, a voice you don't understand." She tightened her hold on his hand. "But if you can hear me, if somewhere inside your mind there's still a small part of you that can take in what I'm saying, then please remember one thing." Celeste drew in a shaking breath. "The medicine in the cabinet. Don't take it. Never take it. The 3 bottles on the bottom shelf to the right, lorazepam, haloperidol, and scopolamine. They're not treatment. I changed them to vitamins. But when I leave, someone will change them back. Don't take them. No matter who gives them to you, no matter what they say, don't swallow." She stopped again. Her voice broke on the last word. Tears fell onto the bedsheet, soaking into 2 small round marks on the white fabric, less than an inch from Damon's fingers. "I'm sorry I can't stay. I want to stay, but Penny only has me. She's 7 years old. She calls me Mama, and I promised my mother I would take care of her." Celeste let go of Damon's hand. One finger at a time, slowly, as though her hand itself didn't want to obey what her mind had decided. She rose to her feet, her knees trembling a little as they left the carpet. She wiped her eyes with the back of her hand, her rough skin, and walked toward the door. She didn't look back. If she looked back, she wouldn't be able to leave. The bedroom door closed with the gentlest touch, so softly that Celeste kept her hand on the knob until the latch slipped into place without a sound. Even as she left, she was still careful not to wake the patient. Her footsteps faded along the carpeted hallway. Then came the sound of her steps on the mahogany staircase. Then the front door opening and closing. Then silence. In the dark bedroom, Damon Kessler opened his eyes. He stared at the ceiling, but he didn't see the ceiling. He saw the 2 tear marks on the sheet, less than an inch from his hand. He saw the impressions in the carpet where her knees had been. He could still feel the warmth left behind on his left hand, where her 10 rough fingers had held him so tightly. She knew he hadn't lost his memory. She knew the medicine in the cabinet was poison. She had changed it to protect him without asking for anything in return. And now, when forced to choose between staying to protect him and running to save her 7-year-old sister, she chose Penny. But even in the final second, even with her last breath before walking out the door, she still warned him. She still tried to protect him with the only words she had left to give. She gave up the job that was paying for the surgery that could save her sister's life, because she would rather lose the money than leave a stranger lying in that bed in danger. Damon sat up, slowly, his back straight, his feet touching the carpet. He sat on the edge of the bed in the darkness, both hands resting on his knees, and stared at the door Celeste had just walked through. For 20 years, Damon Kessler had built his empire on one rule. Everyone had a price. Every loyalty could be bought. Every sacrifice was a transaction. Preston had proved it. Margot had proved it. One by one, every person in his life had proved it. But Celeste Whitfield had just shattered that rule. She had no price. And Damon didn't know what to do with someone who had no price, except for one thing: protect her. He reached beneath the pillow for the second phone, dialed Sully, and the old man answered after a single ring. Sully. Damon's voice wasn't the weak, vacant voice he had used for the past 12 days. It was his real voice, deep, cold, carrying the weight of every life and death decision he had made over the last 20 years. Change of plans. "We end this tonight." 3 seconds of silence on the other end. Then Sully asked, "Preston still hasn't made direct contact with Bryce inside the estate. The evidence isn't sealed tight yet. I don't care. We end this tonight. Boss, if we wait another 2 days then. There's a 7-year-old girl lying in an unfunded clinic because of my game." Damon stopped and drew in a breath. "I won't let that child pay for this war one more day. Call Agent Crawford. Call our people. I want everyone at the estate within 2 hours." Sully didn't ask another question. "Understood, boss." Damon ended the call, set the phone down, and stood up from the bed for the first time in 12 days. He stood in the darkness, 6'2", barefoot on the carpet, the wound in his chest still aching but not enough to stop him from crossing to the wardrobe. He opened it, took out the black suit Sully had hung there on the first day, and began to dress. And while Damon prepared to end everything inside the mansion, Celeste was running through the rain, and the war waiting for her out there, the one she would have to face alone, was even more brutal than any Mafia conspiracy. Celeste stepped out through the mansion gates at 9:43 that night. November rain in Chicago came down without warning, the kind of cold rain that sliced through skin, the kind locals called knife rain because every drop that hit your face felt like a small cut. She had no umbrella. The thin coat she had brought from the apartment on Halsted was soaked through in less than 2 minutes, the fabric clinging to her back and shoulders, cold as a sheet of ice laid over skin. She didn't call a cab, not because she didn't want to, but because in her wallet she had only $11.75 left. The last tip money from the Rusty Nail, the money she had been saving to buy vitamins for Penny, from the Gold Coast mansion to St. Mary Clinic on Ashland, was 10 kilometers. Celeste ran. Her service shoes had been worn through at the heels for a long time, the inner lining showing through, and now the sole of her right shoe tore fully across the middle when she stepped on an iron manhole cover on the sidewalk along State Street. She felt the wet, freezing asphalt push through the split sole, felt the sharp edge of concrete scrape the bottom of her foot through the thin sock. She didn't stop. She ran past the Gold Coast streets, where mansions glowed behind wrought iron fences. She ran past the Magnificent Mile, where the luxury shops had already closed, and the mannequins stood in the windows looking at her with empty eyes. She ran across the bridge over the Chicago River, where the wind rose off the water and blew straight through her rain-soaked coat with a damp cold that cut to the bone. She ran into the South Side, where the streetlights were fewer, the sidewalks more broken, and the darkness heavier. Her right foot started bleeding by the second kilometer, thin blood mixing with rainwater and running inside her shoe, making a faint slapping sound each time her foot hit the pavement. She didn't feel the pain, or maybe she felt it and didn't care, because every painful step on the wet asphalt brought her 1 meter closer to Penny. St. Mary Clinic appeared around the bend on Ashland at 10:43. The 2-story building, painted white once but yellowed with age now, stood under a neon sign that only still lit the letters Street and Rye. The rest burned out long ago. Celeste shoved the door open with both hands, drenched from head to toe, hair plastered to her face, her coat dripping a pool of water onto the linoleum floor. Nurse Rodriguez stood behind the reception desk, and the look on her face told the whole story before her mouth had the chance. Penny lay on the bed in room 3, eyes closed, cheeks flushed dark with fever, hair soaked in sweat and stuck to her forehead. The old heart monitor Celeste had once borrowed sat beside the pillow, flashing 142. Too fast. Too irregular for a 7-year-old child, especially a child with a failing valve. Beside the bed lay the box of crayons with only 5 left and a sheet of printer paper with a half-finished blue butterfly drawn across it. The left wing fully colored, the right wing only outlined in pencil. Penny had started coloring the butterfly and gotten too sick to finish it. Celeste tore off her wet coat and threw it onto the chair, dropped to her knees beside the bed, and placed her hand on Penny's forehead. Hot, hotter than the mild fever from 2 days earlier. The child's skin was dry and red, her lips cracked, her breathing shallow and fast. "Mama." Penny opened her eyes, dazed with fever, but still able to recognize the most familiar face in the world. "Mama's here." Celeste gathered her into her arms, held her tightly, felt the small body burning inside her embrace, felt the irregular heartbeat through Penny's thin chest pressing into her own. "Mama's here," Celeste whispered, her lips against Penny's damp hair. "Mama's here now. I'm not going anywhere." Then the nurse in her took over. Celeste told Rodriguez to bring cold, wet cloths and place them on Penny's forehead, under her arms, and at her groin to bring the fever down quickly. She adjusted Penny onto her left side to reduce pressure on the heart. She checked her pulse every 2 minutes and wrote it down by hand on a scrap of paper, because the clinic no longer had enough equipment to print proper charts. She called 911 and asked for an ambulance to transfer Penny to a larger hospital. But the dispatcher asked which hospital would accept the patient. And when Celeste called Northwestern Memorial, the admissions clerk answered in a cold voice. Uninsured patients must provide a $5,000 deposit before admission. $5,000. Celeste had $11.75, a torn shoe, and a bleeding foot. She ended the call, and for the first time that night, Her hands trembled for a reason that had nothing to do with the cold. Rodriguez sat down beside her at 11, when Penny's fever had come down to 101.8 from the constant cold compresses. The nurse looked at Celeste with sorrow in her eyes and lowered her voice. "Celeste, there's something else. This afternoon, before the fund withdrew support, a woman called asking about Penny's insurance file. She asked very specific questions: the guardian's name, contact address, type of insurance, total unpaid balance." The voice was cold, very professional. She didn't give her name. Celeste closed her eyes. She didn't need to hear another word. She already knew whose voice it had been. The night stretched on. Celeste sat in the plastic chair beside Penny's bed, her back against the cold plaster wall, one hand holding her sister's hand, her eyes never leaving the monitor. She had no weapon, no money, no power, no one. All she had was her own body, sitting there on guard, held upright by the pure will of a girl who had made a promise to her mother 5 years earlier. At 2 a.m, Penny woke, her eyes heavy with fever, and turned her head to look at Celeste. She saw her sister crying. Tears were slipping silently down Celeste's face, falling onto her own hand, falling onto Penny's hand. Penny lifted her tiny fever-hot hand and touched Celeste's cheek. Then she wiped the tears away. "Mama, don't cry." Penny's voice was weak, but serious. Serious in the way 7-year-old children become serious when they are trying to be brave for someone else. "We still have each other." Celeste bit her lip, hard enough that the taste of blood spread across her tongue, metallic and warm, mixing with the salt of her tears. She bent down, pressed a kiss to the little hand wiping her face, and nodded. "Yes, sweetheart, we still have each other." And 10 kilometers away, in the mansion on the hill in the Gold Coast, the Mafia boss was buttoning a black suit, combing his hair before a mirror, and preparing to walk into a room that 2 traitors believed he would never be able to enter. 11 o'clock at night. The study on the 3rd floor of the Kessler mansion, the room with soundproofed walls Damon had once used for his most sensitive meetings, was brightly lit now with 2 people inside. Preston Hale sat in front of the laptop, his fingers moving fast across the keyboard, his eyes fixed on the screen showing the final chain of financial transfers. $340 million in Kessler Holdings shares were in the middle of being moved into the 7th shell company, the last layer before the entire fortune would fall into Bryce Thornton's hands. Bryce had given Preston 14 days. Preston had finished it in 8. Margot sat on the edge of the oak desk, one leg crossed over the other, her black silk dress arranged neatly across her lap. She opened a bottle of 2006 Chateau Margaux, the kind of wine Damon kept in the cellar for special occasions. She filled 2 Riedel crystal glasses, lifted one to eye level, watched the light pass through the dark red wine, and smiled. "At last, it's done." Margot's voice was soft, satisfied, like a woman looking at a painting she had spent months completing. She handed the second glass to Preston. He took it, rose from his chair, stepped between her knees, and kissed her. It was a slow kiss, confident, the kind of kiss shared by people who believed they had already won. "By the time he remembers," Preston said, his mouth still close to Margot's, "there'll be nothing left but the shell." Margot laughed, a small sound inside the soundproof room, and tipped her head against Preston's chest. Neither of them saw the doorknob turn. Neither of them heard footsteps on the carpeted hallway, because the walls were too well insulated. They only realized something had changed when the hall light spilled into the room through the opening door. Damon Kessler stood in the doorway. 6'2", black suit, white shirt, no tie. His collar was open, exposing the fresh scar along his collarbone from the bullet on Interstate 90. His hair was combed neatly to the side. The bruising on his face had nearly faded, leaving only a pale yellow trace beneath the left cheekbone. The bandage at his temple was gone. And his eyes. His eyes were no longer empty, no longer distant, no longer lost. They were cold as tempered steel, sharp as a newly honed blade, and fixed on Preston and Margot with an intensity neither of them had ever seen in all the time they had known him. Because neither of them had ever truly known Damon. They knew the businessman. They knew the fiancé. They knew the employer. But they had never seen the boss. Behind Damon stood Sully at his right shoulder, and 6 men lined the hallway behind them, each dressed in black, each carrying the look of a man who had already received his orders and was ready to carry them out. This wasn't the security team Preston had bought off. The old security team was kneeling on the 1st floor with their hands zip-tied behind their backs, their guns taken away. These were the real loyalists, the men Damon had been secretly contacting through the second phone beneath his pillow for 8 straight days. The wine glass slipped from Margot's hand. The Riedel crystal struck the oak floor and shattered into 7 pieces. The 2006 Chateau Margaux spilled into a dark red pool across the carpet like blood. Margot didn't bend to pick it up. She didn't breathe. She remained frozen on the edge of the desk, her legs still crossed, but every trace of color left her face in less than a second, draining from warm pink to paper white. Preston reacted faster. He spun toward the laptop, hand reaching to slam it shut or wipe the data, any movement at all that might still save something in the final second. But Sully was beside him before Preston's fingers could touch the keyboard. The old mercenary's left hand, the one missing half the little finger, snapped the laptop shut in one clean, hard motion. Then Sully lifted it off the desk, tucked it under his arm, and stepped back behind Damon. Preston remained there with his hands suspended in the air, fingers still curved in the shape of keys they would never touch again. Damon stepped into the room. Each footfall landed solidly on the oak floor, each one sounding with the same soft, measured knock, like the ticking of a clock counting down. He stopped at the center of the room, between Preston beside the desk and Margot perched on its edge. He looked at the wine spreading across the carpet, looked at the 2 crystal glasses, one shattered, one still full in Preston's hand, looked at the open bottle of 2006 Chateau Margaux on the desk. Then he lifted his eyes, looked at Preston, looked at Margot, and he spoke. He didn't shout. He didn't raise his voice. His tone was deep, calm, and so deliberate that every word seemed to carry its own weight, each one falling into the room like a stone dropped into still water. 12 days. Damon reached into the inner pocket of his suit and pulled out a small black USB drive, setting it down on the oak desk beside the wine bottle. For 12 days I lay in that bed and listened to you carve up my empire. Every phone call Preston made from my hospital room, from this study, and from Golden Dragon in Chinatown. Every text Margot sent to Preston with 3 red heart emojis. Every transfer pushed through 7 shell companies. Every time Bryce Thornton said, 2 weeks, or you disappear. Damon paused and let the silence fill the room. It's all on that drive. Preston stared at the USB as if he were staring at a bomb. Margot looked at it as if she were staring at a death sentence. And Damon looked at both of them with the eyes of a man who had heard enough, seen enough, and endured enough. But Damon wasn't finished, and what he said next would make Margot understand that she had never known how terrifying the man she planned to betray truly was. Preston was the first to collapse into the chair. His knees gave out as if someone had pulled the bones right out of his legs, and his body dropped onto the leather seat where 3 minutes earlier he had been sitting to finish stealing $340 million. His 40-year-old face, once composed in every courtroom, crumpled like a sheet of paper crushed in a fist. His eyes went red, his lips trembled, sweat ran from his temples into the collar of his gray suit. Damon, listen to me. Let me explain. Preston raised both hands on instinct, palms out, the posture of a man surrendering. Bryce forced me. He threatened my family, my wife, my kids. I didn't have a choice. You have to understand. You're my friend. I never wanted. Friend. Damon repeated that single word, his voice flat and cold as a frozen lake. He looked down at Preston from above, 6'2", and standing straight over, the man collapsed in the chair. And the distance between them now wasn't only height, it was the abyss between the traitor and the betrayed. You called Bryce from my hospital room, right beside my bed, because you thought I couldn't hear you. You moved my assets every day for 12 days. You brought Bryce's people into my house dressed as doctors from Johns Hopkins. And you prescribed high-dose sedatives to make sure I lost my memory for real if I hadn't lost it already. Damon stopped, letting each sentence sink into Preston like acid. You'll have 15 years in federal prison to explain friendship. Preston opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He sat there with his mouth hanging open, eyes wide, like a fish dragged up out of the water. Margot reacted faster. She slid off the edge of the desk, her heels touching the floor without a sound, and in an instant she transformed completely. Her eyes reddened at once. Tears rose in exactly the right amount. Her mouth trembled at exactly the right frequency. Her whole face shifted from horror into heartbreak in less than 2 seconds. 10 years in the modeling world had taught her how to cry on command, and this was the most important performance of her life. Damon. Margot rushed to him and wrapped herself around him, both arms circling his chest. her face pressed into the shoulder of his black suit, her tears soaking into the fabric. "I'm sorry." Preston manipulated me. "He took advantage of me when I was vulnerable, when I was terrified of losing you after the accident. I love you. I have always loved you. Please believe me." Damon let her hold him. 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds, long enough for her to think the tears were working. Then he lifted his hands and, gently but firmly, peeled each of Margot's fingers away from his chest, like pulling vines off a wall. He stepped back 1 pace and looked at her. "The only person who protected me in this house," Damon said, his voice neither raised nor lowered, every word falling with the steady force of a hammer striking an anvil, "was the girl you called a diner waitress?" Margot blinked. The tears stopped as if someone had shut off a faucet. "She found the sedatives in the cabinet and replaced them with vitamins to save me, without knowing who I was, without asking for a thing." Damon stepped 1 pace closer to Margot, his voice dropping lower. "She gave up the job that was paying for the surgery that could save her 7-year-old sister's life, because she'd rather lose the money than let me swallow poison. She knelt beside my bed tonight, held my hand, and warned me not to take the drugs, even though she thought I couldn't hear her." Damon stopped less than a foot from her face. "And you? You put sedatives in the cabinet to poison me. You destroyed the medical coverage of a 7-year-old child with heart disease to punish the girl who dared to hold your fiancé's hand. Then you sat on my desk, drank my wine, and celebrated." Margot stepped backward. The edge of the oak desk struck her lower back. There were no tears now, no script, nothing left except pure fear in the eyes that, for the first time, couldn't hide anything at all. Sully locked the study door from the inside, and the key disappeared into the pocket of his leather jacket. On the first floor, the old security team Preston had bought off had already been neutralized before Damon ever came upstairs. The 4 fake Johns Hopkins doctors were on their knees on the marble floor of the main hall, their hands behind their backs, faces lowered, guarded by 2 of Damon's men. Damon pulled out his phone, dialed a number he already had saved, and spoke exactly 4 sentences. "Agent Crawford. Damon Kessler. All evidence of financial fraud, attempted murder, and conspiracy with organized crime is ready. Kessler Estate, 3rd floor, study." He ended the call, slipped the phone back into his suit pocket, and turned to Preston 1 final time. He walked to the chair where Preston had collapsed, bent down, and brought his face close to Preston's right ear until his mouth was less than an inch away. Then he whispered, very softly, so softly that Margot, standing 10 feet away, couldn't hear it, so softly that the security cameras in the room wouldn't catch it, so softly that for those few seconds only Preston and Damon existed inside those words. No one but the 2 of them knew what Damon said. But when Damon straightened and stepped back, Preston's face wasn't pale anymore. It was gray. Gray like ash, gray like wet cement, gray like the face of a man who had just realized that 25 years in federal prison was the lightest outcome Damon Kessler was granting him, and that the heaviest outcome needed no courtroom, no jury, only a single phone call. 40 minutes later, 3 FBI vehicles pulled up outside the estate gates. Preston was led away in handcuffs, his eyes lowered to the ground, without saying a word. Margot was taken out after him, her black silk dress wrinkled, her tears long dry, the face of the former model frozen stiff as a wax mask. As she stepped through the front door, Sully stood beside the 3-meter oak frame, arms folded over his chest, and lifted his right hand in a small wave. A farewell wave, paired with the faint smile Margot would remember every night in her cell. 2 weeks later, Bryce Thornton was arrested at the Canadian border while trying to cross into Quebec with a fake passport. Bryce's entire network collapsed within a month. Damon took control of the south side of Chicago without spending a single bullet. The traitorous bodyguards were fired and blacklisted from the underworld. In Chicago, blacklisted meant no one would hire you, no one would speak to you, no one would even dare meet your eyes. One of them came to Sully begging for mercy. Sully looked at him for a long time and then said, "The fact that my boss let you live is blessing enough. Don't test your luck a second time." But for Damon, the greatest victory that night wasn't in the 3rd-floor study with the spilled wine and the USB drive on the desk. It was in the crumbling clinic 10 kilometers away, where a girl in a rain-soaked coat was holding her 7-year-old sister in her arms on a plastic chair. The last FBI vehicle pulled away from the estate at 4:27 in the morning. Damon stood at the 2nd-floor window, watching the red taillights disappear behind the line of oak trees, then turned to Sully. The old man was standing in the corner of the room, arms folded across his chest, waiting. "Find her," Damon said. "Now." Sully didn't ask who she was. He walked to the computer connected to the estate's security system and rewound the footage from 9:43 that night. The image came up on the screen. Celeste stepping through the front gate, thin coat on, old backpack over her shoulders, turning right and starting to run south. The last camera caught her at the corner of State and Division at 9:51, running through the rain, her worn shoes striking the wet asphalt. South. South side. St. Mary, Sully said. The clinic on Ashland, where her sister is. Damon was already in the car before Sully could even reach for the keys. The armored Escalade tore through the streets of Chicago before dawn. The rain gone now, but the roads still wet. Streetlights reflecting in long yellow streaks across the black asphalt. Damon sat in the back seat, suit wrinkled, white shirt pulled loose from his trousers, the pale yellow bruise still visible along his left cheekbone, the fresh scar at his collarbone exposed where his open collar had fallen apart. He didn't look out the window. He looked down at his left hand, the hand Celeste had held at 10 that night, and he could still feel the warmth of those rough, trembling fingers lingering on his skin. St. Mary came into view at 5:04 in the morning. The 2-story building, painted white once and now yellowed with age, stood beneath the last working street lamp on Ashland. The neon sign still showed only street and rye. Sully parked 20 meters from the entrance, shut off the engine, and looked at Damon through the rearview mirror. Damon got out of the car alone. He pushed open the clinic door, crossed the empty reception area, and walked down the hallway with its pale yellow linoleum floor and the smell of cheap disinfectant rising from the walls. The night nurse at the desk looked at him with wide eyes, mouth slightly open, but said nothing as the 6'2" man in the wrinkled black suit walked past as though he owned the whole building. He stopped outside room 3. The door was cracked open. Hallway light spilled through, cutting a thin blade across the small room. Celeste was sitting in a blue plastic chair beside Penny's bed. Her head had tipped to the right, resting against the white plaster wall, her eyes closed. Her right hand held Penny's left, held it tightly even in sleep, as though some buried part of her feared that if she let go, her sister would disappear. Her wet coat still hadn't fully dried, clinging to her back and shoulders, and beneath the chair was a small puddle almost gone now. Her old backpack sat by her feet, partly open, with the medical notebook visible inside, and the photograph of Penny at Lincoln Park that she had taken from the bedside table in her room at the estate before she left. Her worn shoes lay beside the chair, the sole of the right shoe split completely through the middle, the sock inside stained red with dried blood. Her bare feet rested on the cold linoleum floor, and the sole of her right foot carried 3 long scratches that had already begun to scab over. Her cheeks were more hollow than they had been 8 days earlier. There were dark circles beneath her eyes. Her lips were cracked. Penny lay on the bed, her face less flushed now, though the dried trace of sweat still clung to her forehead. Her tiny hand was wrapped around her sister's, even in sleep. On the bedside table sat the sheet of paper with the unfinished butterfly, the left wing fully colored in blue crayon, the right wing still only outlined in pencil. Damon stood in the doorway for a long time. The Mafia boss who controlled half of Chicago, the man who had brought down 3 enemies in one night without firing a single bullet, stood in the doorway of a charity clinic room and felt his throat tighten, not with anger, not with pity, but because the image before him, the 2 sisters curled into a plastic chair and an iron bed inside a 10-square-meter room that smelled of disinfectant, was the truest thing, the most human thing, and the most painful thing he had seen in 20 years. Celeste opened her eyes. Survival instinct moved before conscious thought could catch up. There was a figure in the doorway. Large, dark, motionless. She shot up from the chair, forgetting the pain in her foot, forgetting her exhaustion, stepping in front of Penny's bed, with both arms spread wide even though she was spent, even though she weighed barely 50 kilograms and the man in front of her could clearly overpower her with one hand. But between her and Penny, there had to be her. It always had to be her. Then her eyes adjusted to the light, and she recognized him. Damon Kessler, standing, straight-backed, eyes open, not empty, fully aware. "You," Celeste whispered, her arms still spread in front of Penny's bed. Damon stepped into the room, stopped 2 meters from her, and spoke. Not in a whisper, not with force, just in his normal voice, deep and real. "You switched the sedatives for vitamins. You knew I hadn't lost my memory. You didn't tell anyone. And when it came down to a choice, you left to save your sister. But you knelt beside my bed to warn me not to take the drugs, even though you thought I couldn't hear you." Damon paused. "Why?" Celeste lowered her arms, slowly, not because she wasn't afraid anymore, but because she understood that the man standing in front of her hadn't come to hurt her. Her eyes, the eyes that had cried all night, watched the heart monitor blink for 6 straight hours, bitten her lip until it bled when Penny wiped away her tears. Those eyes met Damon's and answered him. No one deserves to be betrayed by the people they trust most. She stopped and swallowed. "And I know what it feels like to lose everything." Silence. The steady blinking of Penny's heart monitor filled the room. Penny's soft breathing in sleep. The faint whistle of early morning Chicago wind slipping through the crack in the window. "The surgery," Damon said. "How much?" Celeste shook her head at once, so quickly it caught Damon off guard. "Don't turn this into a transaction." Damon looked at her for a long time. Then he nodded. Once. Slowly. He didn't say anything else. He turned and looked around the room, saw the second blue plastic chair folded against the wall, walked over, pulled it out, set it beside Celeste's chair, and sat down. The Mafia boss sat in a blue plastic chair in a charity clinic at 5 in the morning. He didn't give orders. He didn't offer money. He didn't make demands. He just sat there, present. Celeste looked at him, looked at the wrinkled suit, looked at the eyes that were no longer acting, and let herself breathe out. A long, full breath. For the first time in 8 days, she breathed without feeling her chest tighten around it. And Damon kept his word. He didn't turn it into a transaction. He turned it into something Celeste would have never dared to dream of. 2 weeks after that rain-soaked night at St. Mary, Celeste received a letter, a white envelope, no sender's name, no return address, only one neatly printed line across the front. Northwestern Memorial Hospital, Pediatric Cardiovascular Surgery Department, patient Penny Whitfield. Inside was a payment confirmation. The full cost of Penny Whitfield's heart valve replacement surgery, $280,000, had been paid in full by an anonymous, charitable foundation. Included were a private premium room, one of the top pediatric cardiovascular surgeons in the United States, and a 6-month post-operative care program. Celeste read the paper 3 times. The first time, she didn't believe it. The second time, her hands began to shake. The third time, she sank down onto the floor of the Halstead apartment, her back against the wall, the paper pressed to her chest, and cried. Not because she was sad, not because she was afraid, but because for the first time in 5 years of struggle, the weight on her shoulders had been lifted. $280,000, the number that had pressed on her chest like a slab of stone every night while she counted tip money, every morning while she watched Penny sleep, every time she calculated how many days remained before her sister's heart valve failed completely. That number was now 0, and Celeste knew who stood behind it. She didn't have Damon's number. She didn't have an address for him. Sully never appeared again. The Gold Coast mansion was a world she had walked out of and had no ticket to return to. But she knew. Penny had surgery on the 12th day of November. The operation lasted 7 hours. Celeste sat in the Northwestern Memorial waiting room for all 7 of those hours, on the same leather chair she had once passed every day when she still worked there as a nurse 2 years before. She wore clean clothes, her hair brushed neatly, and a new pair of shoes bought from a discount store on the south side. They weren't expensive shoes, but they had whole soles, they were intact, and they were enough for her to walk across a hospital floor without hearing concrete scrape against the bottoms of her feet. When the surgeon stepped out of the operating room, removed his mask, looked at Celeste, and said, "The surgery was successful. The new valve is functioning well. She will recover completely." Celeste didn't scream. She didn't jump up. She didn't throw her arms around the doctor. She only nodded, said thank you, then sat back down in the chair, lowered her head, and cried in silence, the kind of crying she had been good at since she was 22 years old. But this time, the tears didn't taste bitter. A month later, many things had changed. The department chief at Northwestern Memorial, who had framed Celeste, was placed under renewed investigation when an anonymous source provided new evidence from internal hospital records, proving that the medical error 2 years earlier had been the chief's fault, not the trainee nurses. Celeste was cleared, and her nursing license was reinstated. She didn't go back to Northwestern Memorial. Instead, She accepted a position at a newly opened community clinic on the South Side, one dedicated to serving uninsured patients. The clinic was funded by a recently established charitable foundation that didn't publicly disclose the donor's identity. Celeste didn't ask. She didn't need to. On the Tuesday afternoon of her second week working at the new clinic, Celeste was filling out a patient's chart at the reception desk when the front door opened. She didn't look up right away because she was still writing the last line of the diagnosis. "Please take a number and have a seat." Heavy footsteps crossed the linoleum floor. A plastic chair creaked as someone sat down. Celeste finished the last line, looked up toward the waiting room, and her heart missed a beat. Damon Kessler was sitting in a blue plastic chair, holding a numbered ticket in one hand, his back against the wall, his long legs folded carefully into the narrow space between two rows of chairs. Black suit, white shirt, no tie. The scar at his temple had healed, though it was still faintly red, the stitches leaving a small curved mark like a parenthesis on the skin. He sat there like an ordinary patient, between an elderly woman coughing into a tissue and a young man with a cast on his wrist. The Mafia boss who controlled half of Chicago was sitting in a blue plastic chair in a Southside community clinic, holding a number, waiting for his turn. Celeste looked at him. He looked at her. For 5 seconds, neither of them spoke. Then Celeste drew in a deep breath, picked up the patient chartboard, and stepped out from behind the desk. "Patient Kessler? You can come in now." Damon rose to his feet. 6'2" in the middle of that tiny waiting room, filling the space completely. He followed Celeste into the exam room, and as he passed beside her, he stopped. He didn't turn his head. He only stopped walking and spoke softly enough for one person to hear. "You don't owe me anything. I owe you." Then he kept walking into the room, sat down in the patient's chair, and waited for her to examine him. The wound from the ambush on Interstate 90 still hadn't fully healed. He had a private physician. He had a private hospital. He lacked for nothing. But he came here. He sat in the plastic chair. He took a number. He waited, because that was how Damon Kessler said, "I trust you," without needing to say the words out loud. By placing his body, the same body half of Chicago would have happily put a bullet through, into the rough hands marked by the half-moon burn of the girl who used to work behind a bar. At 4 p.m, the clinic door flew open, and a voice rang across the waiting room. "Mama," Penny ran in, her school backpack bouncing on her shoulders, her hair tied into pigtails with pink ribbons, her cheeks rosy, her eyes bright with life. No more pale lips, no more faint, trembling lashes. The 7-year-old girl with the new heart ran across the waiting room on strong legs, jumped into Celeste's lap, and hugged her tightly. Then Penny saw Damon standing in the hallway outside the exam room. She tilted her head, frowned a little, and studied the large scarred man with the fearless eyes only children have. Then Penny walked up to him, stood straight, and held out her tiny hand, the same hand that had been burning with fever just weeks earlier, the same hand that had wiped tears from Celeste's face at 2 a.m. in the room at St. Mary. "Hi, mister. Are you Mama's patient?" Damon looked down at that tiny hand. Then he lowered himself onto one knee on the linoleum floor, bringing himself down to Penny's eye level, and took her hand in both of his. The same hands that had signed million-dollar contracts, the same hands that had clenched into fists hard enough to bleed in the dark, the same hands that had seized Preston's wrist with crushing force. Those hands now held the hand of a 7-year-old child as gently as if they were holding the wing of a butterfly. "Yeah," Damon said. "I'm your mama's patient." And he smiled. Not the cold smile. Not the strategic smile. Not the smile his enemies saw before they lost everything. But a real smile. A smile breaking loose from the deepest place inside a man who had locked every feeling away for 20 years. The first true smile since a 14-year-old boy stood in a cold kitchen on the west side and promised he would avenge his mother. That boy had kept his promise. But today, the man who had grown out of that boy found a new promise. Outside the clinic, Sully sat in the armored Escalade, watching through the window. He saw Damon kneeling to shake the little girl's hand. He saw Celeste standing behind them, one hand over her mouth, eyes wet. He saw Penny grinning wide, her other arm lifting a drawing of a blue butterfly from her backpack to show the patient of Mama. Sully shook his head, smiled to himself, and muttered into the empty car, "The boss is done for." This story isn't about money. It isn't about power. It isn't about revenge. This story is about a simple truth that sometimes takes a whole lifetime to learn. Real loyalty has no price, and the person willing to sacrifice for you when they have nothing is the one who deserves everything. In life, sometimes we're betrayed by the people we trust the most and saved by the people we never expected. What matters isn't how much money you have in your pocket. What matters is who stays when your pockets are empty. If this story made you feel something, please press like right now and share it with a friend, a loved one, or anyone you think needs to hear it. Subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss more moving stories every day. We'd truly love to know how you felt about Celeste and Damon's story. Did it remind you of someone in real life? Have you ever known someone like Celeste? Someone willing to give when they themselves had nothing? Share it with us in the comments. We read every comment and treasure every story you send us from the deepest part of your heart. We wish everyone watching this video good health, a joyful life, and peace in every day ahead. Goodbye, and we'll see you in the next video.